My name is Jake Harrison. I'm just an average office worker in my 30s, toiling away in the daily grind of commuting between home and work. Aging and getting tired seems inevitable, but one of the main causes of my fatigue is the influence of my boss, Mrs. Wilson. Mrs. Wilson is competent, beautiful, and look like a model. On top of that, she is an elite who's been promoted early due to her excellent performance. She's so perfect, people often joke that God must have mistakenly packed all the talent into one person when he created her. However, for some reason, she's tough on me. Jake, there was another error in your paperwork, wasn't there? I'm sorry. I'm not looking for an apology. I want to know why you made a mistake. Listen carefully to what people say, because I often make mistakes. I frequently get scolded by Mrs. Wilson like this. That kind of thing put extra pressure on me to avoid making mistakes, and as a result I'm exhausted. It's always so relaxing here. While saying so, I take a seat on a bench in a park. The park is close to my office, but there are not many people because there are homeless people. That's why I often take breaks here. It's my hidden retreat. Well, let's see how much I can get done today. After finishing my sandwich quickly, I took out some yarn from my bag. People might say it's feminine, but I've always enjoyed crafting. That's why I'm silently knitting here as a way to relieve stress. There's another reason I choose to knit here. Back again today, Jake. Hello, Joe. When I'm knitting, an old homeless man comes to sit next to me. This man is Joe. He's a friendly guy, a good conversation partner for me. People tend to shun him because he's homeless, but Joe doesn't mock me for knitting or call me feminine. He always listens to my stories. I started talking with Joe like this a few months ago. Actually, at that time, I was dumped by my girlfriend I wanted to marry. We had been together for 3 years, but one day she suddenly disappeared, calling me effeminate and disgusting. She had moved out, left me, and that made me so desperate. Even though we dated for 3 years, the way she dumped me was unbelievable. The woolen hat I knitted for her. In the end, I couldn't give it to her. Honestly, I thought about throwing it away. That's when Joe started talking to me. Are you really going to throw that away? Yeah, but would you like to use it? I plan to give it to my girlfriend, but I don't need it anymore. I must have had a devastated look on my face at that time. Joe listened to me compassionately. This encounter became the starting point, and Joe and I began to chat frequently in this park. He still treasures the hat I gave him at that time. He's a truly kind person. You seem even more passionate today. Yeah, you know what? I made a mistake again today. During the brief lunch break, talking to this old homeless man is my way of relaxing. Joe listens to my stories with interest, and I enjoy our time. But the fun time always ends quickly. Well, I'll be back. Don't make a mistake next time. As I packed up my knitting and handed Joe some snacks I had bought for him, I left the place. A few weeks later, I was assigned to go on an outside job with Mrs. Wilson. Mrs. Wilson is very efficient at her work and very popular with our clients. Honestly, I wonder if I'm really needed, but it seems like the reason is the luggage is heavy, so help me. I can't help it because my sales skills are lacking, but I was knitting in the park today, hoping that she would rely on me a bit more. Hello, Jake. Joe, hello. Sorry, I might not be able to stay long today. I have an outside job after lunch. That must be Duff. As usual, he said to me in a relaxed tone. When I talk to him, I feel tension leave my shoulders, and I can relax. He may have once had a job where he had to talk to people. As I was thinking that, my phone rang suddenly. It was Mrs. Wilson. Jake, where are you right now? I'm at Cozy Park. That's perfect. Just decided to use my car for today's field job, so I'll pick you up. After Mrs. Wilson said that, I checked my watch. Indeed, lunch break was almost over. The timing was perfect. I was called by my boss, so I'll leave soon. Is it the scary boss you were talking? Don't say that in front of her. I saw Mrs. Wilson car stop at the entrance of the park. I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilson, for picking me up. It's on the way, so it doesn't matter. I didn't know there was a park here. Mrs. Wilson stared at me in the park and froze. To be precise, she was looking at Joe, who was behind me. D-Dad? Mrs. Wilson ran up to Joe and hugged him. I've been looking for you. I was so worried. Jake, who is this beautiful person? Huh? Looking at the clueless Joe, Mrs. Wilson was frozen. I told Mrs. Wilson that he has amnesia. Knowing the fact, Mrs. Wilson seemed to be shocked. No way. Dad, did you forget about me? Are you sure you're not mistaken? I can't believe I have such a beautiful daughter. You're not mistaken, because those gloves, they were made by Mom. Saying that, Mrs. Wilson was teary-eyed. Come to think of it, Joe always wore those ragged gloves. Even though they were worn out with holes and missing fingers, it was something he had worn since he came here. He seemed to cherish them. Mrs. Wilson asked Joe several times, but Joe just tilted his head. It wasn't getting anywhere like this, so I decided to leave the park with Mrs. Wilson for now. It was time for work, after all. During the field job, we were silent all the way. Mrs. Wilson, who never put personal feelings into her work, is strict but handled things professionally until the work was over. But as soon as the field job ended and we arrived at the parking lot, she burst into tears, perhaps unable to hold it in any longer. All alone, she muttered softly, "Dad, was it so traumatic that you forgot? She looked so pitiful." Mrs. Wilson, if you're okay with it, I'll listen to you. I said this more as a consolation, but it seemed Mrs. Wilson had wanted someone to listen, and she slowly began to talk about Joe. No, about her father, Mr. John Wilson. The Wilson family was a bit wealthier than the average family. Mr. John was a school teacher, and his wife was a nurse. However, when Mrs. Wilson was just starting her career, her mother passed away suddenly. She was involved in a traffic accident, it seemed. Dad loved Mom so much. After she passed away, he quit his job and secluded himself all the time. At the time, Mrs. Wilson, who had already moved out of the house, would check on her father in between work. But as it got busy, she couldn't go home often and couldn't get through on the phone. When a worried Mrs. Wilson finally returned home after a long while, Mr. John was gone. I filed a missing persons report, but he couldn't be found. If I had been by his side, this wouldn't have happened. It seemed like Mrs. Wilson had been blaming herself for her father's disappearance until now, and she cried sorrowfully. Seeing that also hurt me, and I wanted to bring Joe home. But Joe didn't react very well to Mrs. Wilson, and even if I took him home in his current condition, he would likely return to the park. Including getting him examined at a hospital, the hurdles are quite high. Dad, if we return home, will he remember something? Even if he doesn't remember, at least I want to take him to the hospital. Mrs. Wilson, as a daughter worrying about her father. I thought, and then came up with a good idea. Hey, Mrs. Wilson, let's knit. Knit. Joe, Mr. John is a really kind person. The reason I first became friends with him is because he spoke to me when he saw me knitting. He also cherished his gloves, so if you give him a gift, he might be interested and listen to you. Joe always seemed to have an interest in knitting. Then Mrs. Wilson also said optimistically, my mom used to knit a lot. He might vaguely remember that. However, she looked down a bit. But I've never knitted before. It's okay. I'll teach you. Jake, thank you. I'm sorry you had to see me like this. Mrs. Wilson smiled weakly. She seemed a little worried, but it seemed like she wanted to do something for her father. Looking straight at me, she asked, could you teach me how to knit again? Yes, of course. And so I found myself teaching Mrs. Wilson to knit. However, there are only a few places where Mrs. Wilson and I can practice together. We can't go to her house, so we decided to knit in the car. Could you take that thread? Like this? Yes. Now put it through that loop. Oh, it's not going in well. Should I push it further in? Well, no, don't pull the yarn like that. But things weren't going smoothly. I think we had this kind of conversation about 5 times. Mrs. Wilson is very capable at work, but turns out she's actually incredibly clumsy. When the idea of knitting came up, it made sense that she might look down. I honestly thought it would be a long haul, but that's our relief boss, Mrs. Wilson. Apparently, she practiced at home, and before we knew it, she was getting the hang of it. She was using the most basic stitch, and it was pretty rough, but still, she kept at it for several months. Somehow, Mrs. Wilson finished knitting a scarf. Finally done. Let's go deliver it. But what if he doesn't accept it? He's not that kind of person. Come on. I wanted to show Joe the scarf that Mrs. Wilson worked so hard to make, so I took her hand and headed to the park. I used to come to the park quite often, but this was Mrs. Wilson's first time since that day. When Joe saw us, he said in his usual calm voice, "Oh, isn't it Jake? You're not alone today." "Go ahead, Mrs. Wilson." "I know." With a bit of nervousness, Mrs. Wilson looked straight at Joe and offered him the scarf. "Dad, it honestly makes me so sad that you've forgotten me. But I was so relieved to know you're alive. I won't even ask you to come back to home, but I don't want you to catch a cold. I made this in the same color as the scarf my mom used to wear often. It's not as good as hers, but I'd like you to accept it." While telling her heartfelt feelings as a daughter, Mrs. Wilson gives the scarf towards him with a smile. Mrs. Wilson's mother was good at knitting, and this time Mrs. Wilson had made a scarf with a design similar to the one her mother often wore while she was alive. It was filled with Mrs. Wilson hoped that it might jog his memory a bit. Joe accepted the scarf and said, "It's warm. I wonder why. I feel so warm here, just looking at your smile. Ha, I wonder why. I'm in tears." Joe said that as he wrapped the scarf around his neck, touching his chest and shedding a single tear. I wasn't expecting his memory to miraculously return just because of a scarf, but it seemed to have kind of triggered it. After that, he started going to the hospital with Mrs. Wilson, my boss. We're not sure if his memory will ever fully return, but it's said to promote Joe's health and social recovery. He didn't want to be hospitalized, but recently Joe has stopped going to the park and has started to return to Wilson's family home. Perhaps it's because of these positive progress that Joe has started to occasionally remember his own name, which made both Wilson and me happy. By the way, he still has the scarf I gave him, and he wears it alternately every day. Thank you, Jake. It's all thanks to you. And so, I returned to my usual routine of knitting in the park. On that day, Wilson came and sat next to me. Wilson stands out in a good way at the office, so I appreciate being able to talk with her in the park. I'm grateful, but ever since that knitting, Wilson has been acting much more casual with me. I guess we've gotten close, but to me, Wilson is too attractive, and it makes my heart race. What am I doing at my age? I feel so pathetic. You're the one who put all the effort into knitting, Mrs. Wilson. I didn't really do much. Teaching me to knit wasn't a big deal to you? Well, haha. I gave a wry smile as I stuffed my mouth with a sandwich. Through our interactions, I've come to understand that Wilson tends to be stern with those she has high expectations of at work. She had high expectations of me too, which is why she apologized for being so strict. So, Jake, would you like to have dinner with me sometime? To thank you also. Really? I was taken aback by her unexpected suggestion, but Wilson laughed and said, "Of course, or you don't want to have dinner with me? I'll go. I would be honored." I jumped at the chance, which made Wilson laugh again. "You're honest. Can we exchange our contact?" "Yes, I just realized I don't know your contact, Mrs. Wilson." "Call me Sophia. Register me as that, Jake Harrison." "What?" I froze at hearing my full name, but Wilson just input my contact and then casually said, "I'll contact you later," and left. Wilson, she knew my full name all along. It makes me happy and can't help but grin. I'll try my best to get her trust enough for her to call me by my name. While making such determination, I start knitting. A scarf woven in shades of blue and white is what I'm planning to make. I hope to finish it before the dinner with Sophia. And then, I will tell her what I feel. "I love you. Will you be my girlfriend?" I knew it. You took forever to say it. When I finally gathered the courage to confess my feelings over dinner, she happily said so. I wondered if I had been such an open book, but if she got the message, that's all that matters. So we officially became a couple, progressing steadily in our relationship, and eventually we decided to get married. By the way, we haven't had our wedding ceremony yet. Actually, when I proposed to her after a year of dating, I asked Sophia when the marriage registration was supposed to be done. I was thinking we should do it on a special date, but Sophia seemed to have different plans. You do realize I'm over 30, right? Yeah, I know. Don't keep a woman waiting forever. I want to get married right away. Otherwise, I'm afraid someone else might snatch you away from me. What a cute thing to say, so we submitted the marriage registration before the ceremony. So now, although Sophia and I are married, I'm still doing my knitting at the same park. I want to wear a stole you made at our wedding. When you hear something like that, it motivates you, doesn't it? Plus, Joe is planning to come to the wedding. He hasn't remembered everything yet, but he's slowly recalling bits and pieces of his past. I thought our wedding might serve as some kind of trigger, but he seemed unsure, asking, am I even supposed to be there, with an anxious look on his face. So to ease Joe worries, I'm planning to gift him something I've knitted too. According to him, the things we've knitted have been like good luck charms to him and have been really reassuring. What color should I go for? Imagining my future bride, I pick up my yarn again today.